Good day, Harry Potter fans. Welcome to our page, and we are very excited to present to you this audiobook written by none other than Dead Woodpecker, Backward with Purpose, Part 1, Always and Always. So, we'd like to invite you to sit back, relax, probably get a cold bottle of butterbeer, and let your imagination go wild. Here it is, Chapter 1, Prologue.
Chapter 1 Prologue. Chapter Text. Even Creature's steak and kidney pie tasted like ashes in Harry Potter's mouth as he attempted to choke his dinner down. The tea he sipped to clear his tight throat was bitter, corrupt. The house elf did his best. He always did, especially on particularly significant days, but Harry was physically unable to enjoy the elf's offerings. No solace found in food. Not even Ginny Potter, his best source of comfort, could ease the sorrow that weighed heavily on his soul, dragging him into a depression that did not allow him to eat, to drink, to make love. Not today. The three people in the dining room could not pretend, as they normally attempted to, that their broken hearts would heal someday. Ginny played with her food, pushing it around and around her plate without taking a bite. She stared aimlessly at it, her head bowed as though in prayer. Ron Weasley did not even attempt to create an illusion that he was eating. He slouched in his chair, his arms folded across his chest. Harry could see the muscles in his jaw working as he ground his teeth, and his nostrils flared every once in a while as though he was on the verge of tears. "Shall I get the fire whiskey?" Harry asked quietly. "I bought the best. For tonight." "Might as well," Ron said tonelessly. Ginny only nodded, her eyes closed. Harry stood. He could have used magic to summon the bottle, but felt a restlessness. He crossed the room that, despite Creature's best efforts, was as dismal and gloomy as Grimmauld Place had been. His mind skittered away from that thought, though. Despite the gloom of the Black residence, he'd had good times there as well. Remembering the good times made his stomach churn like acid, even more than remembering the bad. There were no photographs anywhere in the house, except in the album Hagrid had given Harry so many years before. There were no cheerful waves coming from dead people to deepen the sorrow. Harry had packed up the pictures himself. It had seemed too much for Ginny and Ron to see their family smiling up at them. "Harry," Ginny's voice cut through his thoughts. He turned toward her. "Yeah, you were just standing there." He saw understanding in her brown eyes. He didn't know where or who he'd be without her. He'd most likely be dead. They'd been married for almost 3 years. They'd married only months after the battle for Hogwarts, clinging to each other with only Ron at their side. Flitwick, the headmaster of Hogwarts and one of the few survivors from the battle, had officiated through tears. "I know, I'm sorry." He ended up summoning the bottle anyway, and 3 shots later, he almost felt numb. "They'd hate what we're doing," Ron said unexpectedly. Harry had lost track of how much of the bottle he'd gone through, but he wasn't his best mate's minder. Ron only talked about them when he was drunk. "I know," Ginny said, "but we do what we can." "Hermione," his voice cracked, and he rubbed his chin. "She'd kick our arses." "She would," Harry agreed. He'd give quite a lot to have his dead friend kick his arse. Fred and George would be. They would be terrible. Ginny tried to smile, but it came out a bit lopsided and disappeared almost as soon as it arrived. "Your mom and dad would have to give us stern talking tis." Harry reached over and grabbed his shoulder with a hand that was not holding his fire whiskey. "Your mum especially." Dad would be. He'd be in the kitchen, looking at the Muggle stuff while Mum yelled at us. Percy would be reading us the riot act, telling us we're not being good role models and that we were disgracing the name of Weasley. Meanwhile, he'd be scheduling interviews. After he got rid of all the bottles of fire whiskey in the house, Ron finished when Ginny's voice faded. Her face was set, her jaw clenched tight, and she gripped Harry's hand fiercely. "Fleur'd be so angry with us that she'd be screaming at us in French," Harry put in. The fire whiskey burned his throat and made it easier to talk. "And Bill would curse us so badly that we'd be old and gray by the time it lifted. Charlie would set dragons on us," Ginny offered. "You know he would. But they were all gone, all of them. A demolished hall, stacked with bodies and washed with blood." Harry shook his head impatiently. They were sleeping in the ground, unaware of the lonely and bitter victory and the pain their deaths had caused. If Harry had known he was a Horcrux sooner, if he had given himself up before the slaughter. "Stop it, Harry," Ginny and Ron said in unison. "We know what you're thinking," Ginny added. "It wasn't your fault. I know," Ginny said, voice gentle. "But lay the blame where blame is due. Voldemort killed them. Bellatrix killed them. Dolohov killed them. And you kill those who stole our family away." "Only once," Harry said bitterly. Ron blew out a deep breath, took another shot, and squeezed his eyes closed. "I'm going to miss them. Always and always." "Always and always," Harry and Ginny echoed. Always and always was a phrase that had initially begun with Harry's proposal to Ginny. It had not been romantic. One solid month of funerals, and the love he'd felt for her was the only thing keeping him sane. "Ginny," he whispered as they lay with arms wrapped around each other. They'd just woken up. Mornings had been difficult then. In that first moment of wakefulness, it was easy to forget that victory looked an awful lot like defeat. "Harry," she murmured against his chest. "I can't live without you," he said simply. "I wouldn't survive." "Me either," she sighed. "I'm going to love you," he said. "Always and always. Will you marry me?" It had been the best he could do. They'd reunited after a year of fruitless searches for the Horcruxes and an open attack on the Burrow. Harry had realized, standing in the rubble, horrified, that despite his best efforts, Ginny and her family would always be targets. He hadn't wanted to lose her without her knowing every day that despite time and distance, she was the best part of him. They'd been hopeful. After another year of Ginny in hiding with her family and frequent visits, Harry had decided that as soon as he'd taken care of Voldemort, he would put a ring on her finger and never let her go. He'd had daydreams of how he'd ask her, possibly in the Gryffindor common room or on a Quidditch pitch. He'd do something romantic. He'd ask Hermione to help him. But it was not to be. It had become a catchphrase, and they'd both said it in the vows they had made to each other on a lonely hill covered in heather. It had struck a chord in Ron, though they hadn't been aware of it for months. It was Christmas Day, and grief had raged inside while a storm raged outside. A day that should have been happy. But when each person had lost everyone else they had ever loved, that was impossible. They found solace in wine. "I'm going to miss them," Ron said. "Always and always." He was not so drunk that he was completely unaware that he had usurped words that were special to Harry and Ginny, and his face fell into apologetic lines. "I'm sorry No," Harry said firmly. He shared a glance with Ginny. "It fits." And it did. Always and always meant him and Ginny, but also meant him and Ron and the past they shared. It meant Ron and Ginny, the only survivors of a large family, more fragile than any of them had ever dreamed. It meant the wounds that would always be there, and it meant the love they would always feel for those they'd lost. They sat in silence for a good hour, and Harry was sure that he was not alone in his thoughts. Ginny had scooted her chair closer to Harry. Their shoulders brushed. He wanted to hold her, bury himself inside her until he lost himself. But it was the anniversary of everything they had lost, and Harry didn't think he could make love to her if he tried. "I wish we had Hermione's time turner," Ron said absently, his voice hoarse. "I wish we could go back. I wouldn't have been incapacitated by that effing curse. I could have protected them. Maybe this is a time turner." "Harry," Hermione's voice echoed from the past, and Harry was struck by a thought so wild and insane that he knew he was even drunker than he'd thought. He tried to stop it, tried to pretend it hadn't occurred to him, but the ludicrous idea gripped him tightly. He opened his mouth, but no words emerged. "Harry!" He could hear the alarm in Ginny's voice. He must look wild. He felt wild. He had the urge to laugh. "What if we could?" he asked. "What if we could?" "Could what?" Ron gaped at him. Not surprising that Harry could not remember feeling so driven. Not since they'd lost everything but each other on the field of battle. "What if we could go back in time?" "Harry!" Ginny sighed. "It isn't possible. It isn't. Time turners can only go back a few hours. You know that. You're drunk. We should go to bed." "No," Harry said forcefully. "We should think about this. We have to." "You're mental, mate," Ron said flatly. "Mental. You shouldn't even be thinking about this. It isn't healthy." Harry's laughter sounded eerie even to his own ears. The way we live isn't healthy, Ron. It's been 3 years, and we haven't done a damn thing since it happened. We're old, and we're only 24. We're barely breathing, the three of us. If you two weren't here, I probably would have committed suicide ages ago. Tears stood out in Ginny's eyes. But Harry, it's impossible what you're thinking. How do you know? Harry asked belligerently. Maybe people have done it. They just never talked about it. What? We're going to build a super powerful time turner. Ron asked. Go back in time and save everyone while remaining hidden? What could we possibly change? Everything, Harry said. Everything. We got to try, damn it. Harry, we have all these memories of living without them, Ginny said. 3 years' worth of memories. If we really did go back in time, we'd already know it. They'd be alive. Not unless we changed fate, Harry said. We'd have different memories. We'd be at the Burrow right now, celebrating our victory, not wallowing in the price we paid to have it. Ron and Ginny exchanged looks. Listen, Harry said, growing frustrated. Ron, wouldn't you want your wife back? Ginny, wouldn't you want to live in a world where your family still breathed? That's cruel, Ginny said softly, but Harry could tell that she was thinking about it. I'm sorry, he said, though he wasn't. He felt almost alive again. He felt the way he did when he made love to Ginny or flew around the countryside with Ron. He felt like he had a purpose. It may not be possible, but he could at least try. I think Hermione might have mentioned something once, Ron said tentatively, his eyes growing distant. It was the morning after you guys rescued Sirius. She talked about how time turners were the most reliable way to travel through time. And if a time turner is the most reliable, then there've got to be unreliable ones, Harry said. We can look into that tomorrow, after we talk to Dumbledore's portrait. We're going to Hogwarts. Ginny asked. Harry knew what she was thinking. They hadn't gone back since the morning after the battle. The rubble had not been cleared away, and the bodies had still been in the Great Hall. Yes, Harry said. Dumbledore would know if there was anything we could do, Ron said. Harry felt strange, to say the least. For 3 years, misery had been eating away at him, at all of them. It was odd to have a purpose again. I really do think there's a way. His madness had affected Ron and Ginny, he noticed. It took a moment for him to recognize the look on their faces. They looked hopeful for the first time in years. Dawn came early the next day, and Harry's sleep had been deep. He had not had a single nightmare. When he awoke, he tossed back one of the bottles of Annie Jigg's hangover remedy that Creature had placed on the bedside table sometime during the night, and leapt from the bed. By the time he washed, Ginny was awake and looking the same way he felt, stunned and purposeful. Why had they not thought of this before? They could have already changed everything. Ron met them in the sitting room not 10 minutes later, his hair still dripping from his own shower. He was not moving like an Inferius anymore, and he almost looked like the old Ron, the Ron that Harry'd gone to Hogwarts with before the death of his wife, parents, and brothers had turned him into a hollow shell. Harry grinned. Ron looked gobsmacked. We're really doing this, then? Ron asked. We're going to try? We are, Ginny said firmly. We are. They left the house together, and Harry was once again surprised by how good it felt to leave it for a reason other than the few necessities that Creature could not acquire for them. They become recluses, Harry thought wryly. They moved forward with purpose, past the wards, and disapparated together with a loud crack. Hogsmeade was how he remembered it from his 4th year, without dementors and fear. People walked openly along the twisted and narrow streets, and Harry only felt a small twinge of resentment at these people who lived and laughed in a world without Voldemort. They had not paid the price the way Harry, Ron, and Ginny had. But they would change that, Harry thought fiercely. Ginny gripped his hand so hard that Harry felt his knuckles pop. When he looked at her, he saw her blazing look, for once not dimmed by sorrow. They would do this. The path to Hogwarts was as long as ever, but seemed to take only minutes. No one had recognized them. Thank Merlin. He supposed that people had stopped hoping to see them. They'd been hidden away for so long. The gates loomed ahead of them, strong and stoic. Harry remembered when they were twisted and broken after the assault of Voldemort's giants. Harry, the three whirled around and saw Hagrid, his mouth open wide with disbelief. He was just as tall as ever, and even wider than when Harry'd last seen him more than 2 years previously. "Ron? Ginny." Hagrid was too stunned to move. "Hi, Hagrid," Harry said. Ron and Ginny echoed him. "Wah, what are ye three doing here?" "We've come to see the headmaster," Harry explained. "Can you get us in the gates?" Hagrid pulled them open with one hand and then rushed them, pulling all three into a bone-crushing hug. Harry patted him on the back. When he finally pulled away, he saw tears streaming into his wild beard. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Harry couldn't think of anything to say. Ron and Ginny were silent beside him. Hagrid did not seem to take offense at this, and chattered all the way up to the school. Grop apparently had found a lady friend, and the Centaurs had welcomed 3 new foals into the herd. Seamus Finnegan had apparently taken a post at the school and was now the professor for defense against the dark arts, despite his missing arm. They rounded the greenhouses and found themselves staring up at a sight they had never expected to see again. The grief welled up inside Harry as he stared at the repaired castle. The astronomy tower had been rebuilt, and Hogwarts looked as stately as ever. There were no bloodstains on the steps. It was as if it had never happened. But it had. Bill and Fleur had fallen just over there. Harry could still hear her screams as she stood over Bill's body, taking down 3 Death Eaters before Dolohov had killed her. His mouth twisted grimly, and Ginny squeezed his hand. The entrance hall was even worse. In his mind, Harry could still see Hermione burning and hear her anguished cries, could see George falling and breaking his entire body, could see Arthur Weasley hit in the back with Avada Kedavra while he'd been trying to avenge Bill's death. Charlie had been mangled by Fenrir Greyback just over there, near the stairs. And that was where an acromantula had torn Percy apart. Ginny's eyes were wide with horror. She hadn't seen most of her family die. She'd been battling Death Eaters with Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, but she'd seen the bodies where they lay. Harry had thought she was dead, had thought the cutting curse had killed Ron. And 50 feet and 3 years away from where he stood right now, he'd stood in front of Voldemort and had not defended himself, had watched death speed toward him in the form of a green light because he'd wanted to die. It had killed the Horcrux instead, and Harry had returned to finish off Voldemort, not knowing that Ron and Ginny had survived too. He took a deep breath. Ron had his eyes squeezed tightly shut, his mouth moving, saying something Harry could not hear. Ginny shook like a leaf beside him. "Ye lot." Hagrid sighed. "I know why you didn't want to come back." Harry nodded stiffly. "We still need to see Flitwick." They left Hagrid and their memories behind and moved up the stairs with purpose. It was early yet no students were out and about. They were still sleeping in their dormitories. The gargoyle that guarded the home of the headmaster was the same. Harry realized that he had no idea what the password was and could not even begin to guess it. Ron kicked it with his foot. "Open up." "No," the gargoyle said firmly. "You don't know the password." Harry was just about to send a message via Patronus when he heard footsteps quickly coming toward them. Merlin's balls. Seamus Finnegan skidded to a halt 10 feet away from them. He threw out his arm and braced himself against the wall. "I didn't think you 3 were even still alive." "Hi, Seamus," Ginny said quietly. Ron and Harry nodded at him in greeting. "Do you know Flitwick's password? We got to speak with him." Seamus visibly tried to collect himself. It was odd seeing him with only one arm. At least it hadn't been his wand arm that had gotten severed off. "It's Caeliodoc." The gargoyle sprung aside, and the moving stairs appeared behind it. "What's Caeliodoc?" Harry whispered. Ginny shrugged. "We'll see you, Seamus," Ron said. "We'll catch up later." "Ya." They left him still standing there with his mouth gaping open. "Yeah, see you around." Harry knocked firmly 3 times. It took several moments for Flitwick to open the door, and they were greeted with the same expression of shock they'd seen on Hagrid's and Seamus's faces. Well, Flitwick drew himself up to his full height, about 3 feet. "Well, Headmaster," Harry said respectfully, "we were wondering if we could converse with Dumbledore's portrait." Yes, of course." Flitwick led them in. It was similar to, yet very different from how it had been during Dumbledore's time. The small, delicate instruments, the ones that had survived Harry's wrath anyway, were gone and had been replaced by stacks of books. The portraits were the same. The occupant of the biggest one that hung right behind the large desk stared at Harry with widened eyes. "Harry," the portrait of Albus Dumbledore said, "and Mrs. Potter and Mr. Weasley." "Dumbledore," the three murmured. "Should I?" Flitwick made vague motions toward the door. Harry felt a pang of guilt at forcing the diminutive man to leave his own office. "If you don't mind." The door shut, and they were left alone. Suddenly, Harry could not think of the words to say. He felt uncomfortable, and Dumbledore's piercing gaze and the mutterings of the other portraits did not make it any better. Ginny nudged him, and Harry realized that he'd been staring for longer than he'd expected. "The price was too high," Harry said heavily. He felt tears sting his eyes. Dumbledore had to know if it was possible. He had to. "Oh, Harry." The portrait leaned back in his chair. "Is there any way? Do you know?" Harry took a deep breath. "We want to change it." Dumbledore was silent for a long time. "We know a time turner wouldn't work," Ron said gruffly. Ginny had started to shake again. "We want to go back to the battle," Harry said firmly. "Why?" Dumbledore asked. He'd folded his hands together and pierced each of them with his gaze. Harry's mouth fell open. "Wasn't it obvious?" "We want to save them, Dumbledore." "We're not. We can't. We have a try." "Is there?" But Dumbledore interrupted him. "You misunderstand. Why go back to the battle? You could do very little. You might save one or two, but there would still be heavy losses." Ginny stiffened. "Is there a way or not?" Ron asked loudly. Harry felt like kicking him. They needed Dumbledore on their side. "Yes," said Dumbledore. Harry turned away and ran his hands through his hair. Ginny gave a wordless cry and clapped her hand over her mouth. Ron was breathing heavily, as if he had just run a few kilometers. "There is a way," Dumbledore continued. "There are several, actually, but only one that is advisable at this juncture. It isn't instant, of course. You will need to make several preparations, including a very complex potion and complicated spell. You are lucky there are three of you. One man alone would find it nigh impossible." "We'll do it," Harry said instantly. "Right now." "Ah, but there's no right now when it comes to this," Dumbledore told them. "You will need to prepare. The potion itself takes 3 years. 3 years. Not to mention, there are certain decisions you must make regarding it. How far back you need to travel, for instance. That must be decided before you even begin to make the potion, for the amount of ingredients you will need will vary slightly. But we won't go back 3 years," Harry said. "To the battle." "I would not advise that," Dumbledore said. "This is not at all like a time turner. There will not be two of each of you running around. You will find yourself as pressed and challenged as you were that night. The only thing that will be different is that your memories of this timeline will remain. You will know when and where things you wish to stop happening will happen, but there is no guarantee that you will be able to." "Or you think we shouldn't do this?" Ginny asked tentatively. "Because we've already made up our minds. I very much think that you should do this, Mrs. Potter." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled like mad. "But if you're doing this, you should do it right. In for a canute, in for a galleon, I'd say." "What the bloody hell does that mean?" Ron asked rudely. "Hold on." Harry's mind worked frantically. "I think. Do you mean that we should go back further?" "Excellent, Harry." Dumbledore looked as pleased as though he'd gotten good marks on a difficult essay. "If you go back far enough, you could stop the final battle from happening at all." Harry thought back. They could go back to any point in the years that Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been searching for Horcruxes. He knew exactly where they were. It would have made it so much faster and easier to hunt them down and destroy them. Voldemort would have less time to amass his army, and the odds against those who chose to stand with Harry would not be so bleak. He could even be sure to save Remus and Tonks and Teddy from being murdered in their own home. But what if he could go back to before Dumbledore had died? He could stop him from putting on the ring. Snape would not have needed to kill him, and Harry could have the brilliant wizard at his side. Or he could go back even further. Sirius. The battle in the Department of Mysteries could have been avoided. Harry knew full well that it would be a trap. He wouldn't even go. And if he went back to his 4th year, he could ensure that Voldemort did not rise at the time, and Cedric could survive. Ron and Ginny were watching him cautiously, and Harry realized that he was beaming. "I think we ought to go back to our 1st year," he told them. "We can take care of the Horcruxes, we can stop a lot of bad things from happening, and we can have years and years of preparing before Voldemort is resurrected. Dumbledore. He turned to the portrait. Do you think I'll still have a Horcrux inside me if I go back? Absolutely, he said. The only things that will change are your memories. The prophecy will still exist, although I'd be curious to see if it changes at all. It is possible. Harry looked alarmed, but Dumbledore rushed to reassure him. It will not change the essence of the prophecy, I don't think, but I would not be surprised if the wording changed. What is this method, Dumbledore? Ginny asked. The potion is called the Tears of Merlin. He was the one who created it, and, I believe, the only one to use it. The spell is called the Web, or the Bent Reality. It takes both to do it. They're very clearly entwined with each other. Dumbledore paused. I would suggest that you plan extremely carefully what you intend to do. Write it all down. Go through it step by step before you even begin. You'll be allowed some room, but your goals must be clear. Why? Ron asked. The key ingredients of the potion are your memories, Dumbledore said quietly. You'll need to add as much of them as you can, everything you can offer. I would recommend speaking to others about their memories of the war, and add those in as well. All the knowledge you have will give you greater ammunition for your 11-year-old selves. So the potion involves our memories? Harry asked. Is it like a pensieve? Yes. Dumbledore beamed at him. Exactly. But once those memories are in the potion, you can't access them, which is why you need to plan very, very carefully. I will, of course, be of all the help I can. The last memory you will offer will be making the potion. The only thing you won't be able to take with you is the incantation for the spell. And where can we find information on this? Ron asked, and then added hopefully, do you have it memorized? No, but you'll find it in the restricted section in a slim book called Memories Unbound. It has an entire chapter. Well, Harry said finally, it looks like we've got quite a lot of work to do. If anyone could do it properly, it'll be you three, Dumbledore said. I only have one thing to ask of you. Please tell me. I know, he paused. I know it made you angry that I kept things from you, Harry. And I do apologize. Of course we're going to tell you, Harry grinned at him. I'm not about to alienate one of my best allies. We'd better get to work, Ron said. 3 years starts now. HP. In the end, it took them 4 years of careful, plotting preparations. Despite their impatience, they knew they had to get this right. They had a lot to lose. The black-haired man sat beside a red-haired woman whom he barely remembered, but for whom he felt an aching tenderness, though he did not know why. Theoretically, he knew that he and the woman and the red-haired man were working on something desperate, something that kept them going even though they had no idea what. Sometimes they joked about it. He had the feeling that they used to joke a lot more. Yesterday, the strange potion had crystallized. 3 shards of what looked like translucent, glowing glass remained in the cauldron. The black-haired man wanted to touch it, even though he knew that that was the last thing he should do. It would ruin everything. But what, he asked himself, was everything? He knew that he would find the answers in the cauldron, but every time he thought of touching it, his heart constricted in his chest. The red-haired man asked him every day if he knew why they couldn't touch it, but the black-haired man couldn't remember. We have to say the spell, the beautiful red-haired woman said. It's ready. How do you know? The black-haired man asked fearfully. What if it isn't? It says here in our notes, she replied. I wrote this. When the potion crystallizes, it is time to use the spell. Do not touch it. All right, the red-haired man said. We'll say the spell. I remember the spell, at least. Just not anything else. Isn't that what was supposed to happen? The black-haired man asked. It frustrated him that he could not remember this man's name. He felt that he ought to know it, but his entire head felt like a gaping hole. Yes, we've written it all over here, the red-haired man said. I wonder why we kept writing notes to ourselves. I don't know if we'll ever know. We should say it, the black-haired man said firmly. Right now, before we forget anything else. They clasped hands. The red-haired woman began a long incantation that sounded like a song. The 2 men joined in. They kept it up, even as the lights went out and the room darkened. The only light came from the cauldron. The black-haired man watches as the shards of glass rose in the air and stuck to something that looked like a spider web made of tiny lights. It hurt his eyes, so he blinked. The room steadily darkened, and the woman's palm was sweating. The other man was shaking. He heard a cry that lifted the hairs off his neck. He'd never heard anything like it. It seemed to last for a lifetime, and then everything went completely dark. A strange thought echoed through his mind, for always and always. Still gripping the other's hands, he tumbled forward into nothing.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you Harry Potter fans out there. Welcome back to our page. We are continuing on with Chapter 2 of Backward with Purpose, Part 1, Always and Always by Dead Woodpecker. So, just sit back, again, chill out, relax, and listen in to Chapter 2, The Headmaster.
Chapter 2. The Headmaster. Chapter text. Harry Potter opened his eyes to find himself in a room he had not seen for well over a decade. Dudley's second bedroom looked remarkably the same, and Harry felt a strange sense of vertigo. He dug the heels of his hands against his eyes and sat up straight. The moment of disorientation passed, and he laughed out loud. They had done it. He, Ron, and Ginny had actually sent their memories back in time. He looked down at his small hands with wonder. He stood up, tore off his clothes, and stood naked in front of a mirror. He was 11 years old again. He laughed until tears streamed down his face. Aunt Petunia chose that moment to bang on his door. "Get ready. You better not make us late. You're lucky we're even taking you to that place." He was 11 years old and heading off to Hogwarts for the very first time the second time around. Everything was the same. The same breakfast, the same headlines on the newspaper Uncle Vernon read at the kitchen table, the same vacant expression in Dudley's eyes, and the scream he gave when he saw Harry staring at him. The car ride was the same, and Uncle Vernon shouted the exact same words he had before. And in what felt like no time at all, Harry was standing alone in front of the barrier to platform 9 3/4. He waited around, hoping to catch sight of the Weasleys. He felt some anxiety. The efforts may have placed him exactly where he wanted to be, but his wife and best mate might have had trouble. Packed with muggles, of course, he heard Mrs. Weasley say, and spun around. Their coming toward him was his favorite family in the world. They looked just as frazzled, but it was such a beautiful sight that Harry had to turn away to compose himself. He schooled his features, trying to look a little lost, and hoped that his anxiety would not be misinterpreted. Percy strode forward rather pompously and disappeared beyond the barrier. The twins, after giving their mother trouble, did likewise. Harry watched them go, and hoped he didn't look like a maniac. He couldn't seem to stop himself from grinning wide enough that his cheeks felt like they were about to split. "Excuse me," he said a bit shakily. "Do you know how to get through the barrier?" "First time," Mrs. Weasley asked kindly. "It's Ron's first time, too." She gestured to her son, as if Harry did not know this boy almost as well as he knew himself. Ron grinned, and when his mother looked away, winked at Harry. Harry grinned back. "Best to do it at a bit of a run if you're nervous," Mrs. Weasley was saying. "Go on, you go first." He passed through the barrier and immediately set off to find the empty compartment at the end of the train. His head swiveled back and forth. He drank in the sight of so many people he'd known and lost. Lee Jordan was there with his tarantula. Angelina Johnson screamed when he thrust it toward her, while Katie Bell and a fifth year, whose name escaped Harry, looked on and laughed. "I've lost my toad again, Gran," he heard Neville say to his formidable-looking grandmother. "Oh, Neville," she sighed. Harry covered his mouth to hide his grin. He still struggled with his trunk, and was just about to levitate it when George came up. "Need help with that?" "Please," Harry said. "Boy, Fred, come here and help," George called. Together, the three of them lifted it up. When Harry paused to wipe his forehead, Fred gasped. "What's that?" He pointed at Harry's forehead, where the lightning scar was highly visible. "Blimey!" George noticed the same thing. "It is." They stared at Harry, their mouths gaping. "You're Harry Potter," they said in unison. Yeah, that's me," Harry replied. They kept staring at him, but left when Mrs. Weasley called them. Harry, feeling a bit overwhelmed, threw himself down on the seat, making sure he had a good view of the Weasley family. He stared at Ginny, and she must have felt his gaze because she lifted her eyes to him. Even from here, he could see that she was crying. He wanted to jump off the train and hold her, but forced himself not to by taking deep breaths. He remembered very clearly what they had decided. They could not do anything at all suspicious. Not until the time was right to tell them all. Ron's been acting odd all day. He heard Percy tell his mother loftily, "I think he's nervous about Hogwarts. But don't worry, Mum, I'll take care of him. It's my duty as a prefect." "Oh, are you a prefect, Perce?" Fred asked with an air of great surprise. Harry laughed as they mocked their brother, and ducked his head when they mentioned meeting him. "Are you sure it was him, Fred?" Mrs. Weasley asked. "How could you tell?" "His scar," George said. "It's really there like lightning." Ron found Harry a few minutes later, just as the train was pulling away from the station. "Anyone sitting here?" he asked slyly. Harry laughed. "Nope, just me." His eyes fell on Wormtail, and he was glad to see that Ron had not made good on his threat to murder him as soon as possible. While it would have made Harry quite pleased to think that the man who had betrayed his parents to Voldemort and had, any other time, murdered Daphne Greengrass and Dean Thomas, Wormtail had to live until Sirius could be freed. He and Ron chatted idly for a time. Harry could not help but be impressed by Ron's ability to dissemble. "You've got a big family," Harry observed. "Yeah, they all went to Hogwarts too," Ron replied. "My little sister is going to turn 11, so next year she'll be at Hogwarts too. She cried all morning about it, actually. Says she wishes she could be with us too. But if I didn't know any better, I'd say she's a bit glad to have Mom and Dad around for one more year." Harry gave him a grateful look. So Ginny had been crying, but Harry bet 100 galleons that she was crying for completely different reasons. "This is Scabbers." Ron held up the snoozing rat. "He's not much. He used to be my brother Percy's rat. Ginny almost killed him today. Isn't that right, Scabbers? He was sleeping. He always sleeps." And she accidentally stepped on him. His face darkened. "At least I think it was an accident. She might have thought that I'd stay home if my pet was hurt." Harry had to hide his laugh. He hoped she'd hurt him bad. "Poor Scabbers," he said solemnly. The lunch trolley came and went. Harry once again bought plenty of snacks, although this time Ron threw his sandwiches out the window and ate chocolate frogs like there was no tomorrow. Both he and Ron chatted idly, careful, very careful, not to say anything at all odd. While Scabbers had only been a rat until their 3rd year, they could not afford to let Peter Pettigrew, betrayer of friends and murderer of muggles, hear anything suspicious. They knew very well that they walked a very narrow path. They were also well aware that they'd be visited by old friends who had no idea who they were, so it did not come as a surprise, although Harry's stomach gave a jolt, when Neville Longbottom, last seen dead on the flagstones of Hogwarts, opened the door and poked his head in, so shy that he did not meet their eyes. "Have either of you seen a toad?" "I've lost mine." It was lucky that his eyes were averted, for Harry had a huge lump in his throat, and he could tell by the look in Ron's eyes that he was thinking the same. "No," Harry said softly. "Sorry." "Thanks, then." Neville disappeared. Ron took several deep breaths and glanced at Wormtail swiftly. "He scared me, popping out like that. I didn't even hear the door open." "Me either," Harry winked. "I wonder what our classmates are like. He seems a nice enough sort." That didn't nearly cover it. Neville had been a champion and fearless when it came to defending his friends. This time around, his life would not end in murder. He would not leave Hannah a widow less than a year after their marriage. He'd work with plants, have a bunch of round-faced babies, and live to be a doddering old man. And Harry would never, ever have to watch him die. Harry shut his eyes. He and Ron sat in silence for a long while. Harry suspected that his best mate had fallen into the same morass of disturbing memories that he had. Ron drew his wand after perhaps an hour and made vague, flicking motions, while glancing hopefully at the door again and again. Harry knew what he was waiting for: Hermione. She did not disappoint them. A short, bushy-haired, buck-toothed girl huffed in with Neville on her heels. "Have either of you seen a toad?" she asked bossily. "Neville's lost one." For a moment, just a moment, Harry saw her on fire. He firmly pushed those memories away. Sorry. We still haven't seen him." "Oh, are you doing a spell?" she asked eagerly. She plunked down on the seat opposite Ron, next to Harry, and focused all her attention on the wand in Ron's hand. It's not a very good spell," Ron said. His hand was trembling a little. My brothers Fred and George taught me it. Harry watched in amusement as Ron stuttered through that useless little rhyme the twins had taught him long ago, just to torment him. Struck with inspiration, he eased his own wand out of his pocket and sent a wordless stinging hex at the treacherous rat. The effect was immediate. Wormtail sprang up, hair raised, and ran squeaking around and around the compartment. Hermione, who had looked skeptical as soon as she heard the beginning of the rhyme, looked on with her mouth agape. That wasn't supposed to happen, Ron muttered. He was supposed to turn yellow. It took several minutes and all three of them to catch the rat. Sorry, Scabbers, he said. If Harry didn't know him as well as he did, he would have had no reason to doubt his sincerity. Hermione didn't even look at all suspicious. Well, that wasn't a very good spell, was it? She asked haughtily. I think you hurt the poor little thing. Nah, Ron said. Look, he already went back to sleep. I'm Hermione Granger, she announced. And you are? Ron Weasley. Harry Potter. Are you really? She sat up straight and stared at him, her eyes wide. I've read all about you. You're in the greatest wizarding events in the 20th century and all sorts of other books. The chosen one who defeated he who must not be named. What the hell? Harry nearly fell off his chair and exchanged startled glances with Ron. Oh, honestly, don't you know? Hermione asked, tilting her nose in the air. If I were you, I'd have read everything I could about it. Everyone knows that you were the prophesied defeater of you-know-who. Oh, uh-huh. Ron, obviously thinking very quickly, gave a shaky little laugh. Of course he knows. Everyone knows. Yeah, Harry nodded, trying to look as though this was not completely new to him. I was just surprised, that's all. Damn right. Since when was the prophecy common knowledge? His insides twisted with anxiety. Wellsa changed. Hermione sniffed. Good. She looked Harry up and down appraisingly. I don't suppose you know the entire prophecy? Did he? That's all right, she said, but looked disappointed. You probably wouldn't tell me if you did. It's such a big secret. Hermione chattered on for a while. Harry attempted to pay attention to her, but his thoughts were whirling and whirling inside his head. It was imperative that he speak to Dumbledore. Tonight, if possible. From that point on, the entire trip became much less pleasant, and not only because Malfoy had made his appearance, attempted to cousin up to Harry, and had taken exception to being rebuffed. Draco Malfoy had turned out to be not quite the arse Harry had expected, but that didn't mean that Harry liked him any better. He was still a foul bigot, just not a foul, bigoted murderer. Ron and Harry were much more subdued when they got off the train and got in the boats. Seeing Hagrid had alleviated some of the tension, and seeing the excitement on so many of the faces of Harry's classmates, including several who had died in ways that plagued Harry with guilt, did more. But it was with a heavy heart that he sailed across the lake and trudged up the stairs. It was not until Professor McGonagall, sane and upright, opened the door for them that Harry once again felt the fierce resolve that had driven him for the last 4 years. Harry walked beside Ron into the great hall and did not have to feign wonder. So many people here that he had thought lost. Dumbledore chatting, Snape scowling, and countless others alive and merry. It was almost too much. Always and always, he thought. He desperately needed to talk to Ron. They had a lot to discuss, the prophecy, and how to let Ginny know about the change, and to plan the finer details of the prank they were to pull on the potions master. He only hoped that they could detach themselves from the horde of first years long enough to make a break for the room of requirement. Harry felt almost naked without the invisibility cloak. Potter, Professor McGonagall stared at him, her mouth a thin line. I suggest you allow yourself to be sorted. Ron snorted and pushed Harry forward. He put on the sorting hat, feeling a bit nervous about the hat's reaction. He had no idea how it would react, and Dumbledore's portrait had been almost as clueless. Voldemort had destroyed it after he'd used it to suffocate Neville Longbottom. It seemed to Harry that the hat had sighed. He could almost feel it in his brain. This is something beyond rare. The hat seemed not to be particularly eloquent when faced with something that surprised it. Harry felt the mad urge to laugh. More rare than surviving a killing curse at the age of 1. He thought, knowing the hat would hear. The hat was silent for a long time, longer than the first time, and Harry began to shift uncomfortably in his seat. Don't you dare put me in Slytherin. He warned it. I ought to. I really ought to. I can see all the cunning in you, although of a different sort than I usually see. The ambition, the drive, is there as well, even if it is to prevent what happened before. Not to mention the thirst to prove yourself. Please. Harry felt as though he'd reached a new low, begging a hat. I think you're right. The hat finally murmured. It all comes down courage, doesn't it? I don't think I've seen the like in many a year. Gryffindor, the hat shouted. Harry was far too relieved to notice that there were far more speculative glances than applauding hands this time around. Blimey, Harry, that was close. Ron threw himself down on a plush armchair that the room of requirement had manifested. They'd taken a brief detour to retrieve the wretched tiara Horcrux from the room of hidden things. It had taken longer than expected, but Harry held it in his hand. You were up there for almost 15 minutes. You were up there for almost 10, Harry said sourly. At least we're in Gryffindor, mate. That was way too close, Ron agreed. Speaking of close, we can't stay long. Percy would hang us. Ron smiled fondly. You know, I'd almost forgotten how pompous he was. Harry said quietly. I can't believe we actually did it, Harry, Ron said seriously. I wasn't sure. We're here. They grinned at each other madly, and Harry once again felt on the verge of tears. But he forced himself to not get too complacent. Having everyone back was amazing, but they had to move forward with purpose. But what exactly have we done? I have no idea. Ron shook his head. It seems like a small sort of change, honestly. And Hermione said that no one knew all of it, so the you being a Horcrux thing is probably safe. Harry shuddered. Can you imagine what Voldemort would have done if he'd known? No, Ron said. I don't want to think about that. But it makes me wonder what else has changed. Makes me wish we'd come back a few days earlier. Maybe we could have figured some of this stuff out. Without being here and worrying about Quirrell, Harry agreed. He made a face. I'm glad I didn't have to be around the Dursleys that much. It was kind of cool to realize that, yes, they really are total arses. But any more of them and I'd feel sick. I got to put up with it over the summers. Yeah. Ron looked thoughtful, and Harry had a laugh. What? Just that I never saw that expression on your face until at least second year last time. Ron threw a pillow at him. We're going to have to wait until we speak to Dumbledore. Harry turned the conversation back to more serious matters. You can write a letter to Ginny tonight, though, and give her a heads up. Yeah, that's what I reckon, too, Ron replied. He looked down at his watch. We've got to go. They'll be suspicious if we don't turn up soon. Not to mention we've got to nick those dung bombs from the twins. They rose to go, but Harry halted. Is it bad to be looking forward to all the trouble we're going to cause tomorrow? Ron snorted. No. Is it bad to be having impure thoughts about an 11-year-old girl? Harry laughed. It's better than thinking the same about a 10-year-old. We've become very perverted, Harry. HPHPHPHPHPHPHP. Dear Ginny, I'll bet you're surprised I'm writing you already. The Express was amazing. We saw loads of cool people. By we, I mean Harry Potter. Yes, the Harry Potter, the one you want to marry. He's a cool bloke, and he asked me if that red-haired little girl, you, in case you're too thick to realize it, was my sister. I think he fancied you. Anyway, this girl Hermione Granger came in and started talking all about that prophecy. She asked him if he knew what it was, and I don't think he did. We tried our very first bit of magic, too. We meant to turn Scabbers yellow with that spell Fred and George taught us, but instead it hurt him, and he ran squeaking all around the compartment. I thought it was funny, but I didn't want to hurt the rat's feelings, so I didn't laugh. Harry and I are in Gryffindor. I was hoping that would happen, but it took the sorting hat. Yes, it's a harmless hat. We didn't have to battle a troll at all, about twice as long to sort us as it did everyone else. Anyway, I've got to go wash. I smell like Fred and George. Ron, P.S. say hi to Annie Muriel for me, and try to steal her tiara. HPHPHPHPHPHPHPHPHPHP. Time marched swiftly the next day. Transfiguration and charms went well, Harry had to say. He'd been quite nervous about being in a first-year class, pretending not to know spells that he'd mastered 16 years previously. There was a fine balance between looking suspiciously genius and suspiciously stupid, but Harry thought he'd done all right. Ron, walking beside him on their way to potions, looked disgruntled. He'd been a bit more lax than Harry. and had tried to impress Hermione. Harry had wanted to laugh at the look on his face when she'd still managed to turn her match into a needle before he had. "Cheer up, mate," he said in a low voice. "She'll always keep you on your toes." "At least we get to torture Snape now," Ron muttered. They filed in with the rest of their classmates, and Ron managed to find a seat next to Hermione without making it look intentional. Snape, black cloak billowing behind him, made quite the entrance and glared at those who were too thick to realize that he was not a teacher to annoy with unapproved chatter. What happened next startled Harry. It was word for word identical as the last time. Snape attempted to humiliate him, of course, by pointing out his celebrity status. The thoughtful crease in the professor's brow, however, Harry was pretty sure was different. He then was practically interrogated by the man and asked questions that he knew for sure that no other first-year student, besides Hermione, of course, would know. His own reaction to it was different. Not on the outside. Harry made sure to fidget and say, "I don't know a lot." But his emotional reaction was quite different. The first time around, he'd felt badgered, confused, and furious. This time, he felt an odd sort of kinship with the man. Snape had lost the one person he'd cared about, Harry's mother. The fact that he'd lost her years before she died was immaterial. The loss had devastated him, had turned him bitter, and he'd been broken. But when all was said and done, and Harry had viewed his memories, too late, far too late, he had realized that Snape was quite possibly the bravest man he'd ever met. He was so lost in thought that he nearly forgot to give Ron the cue. He elbowed him sharply. Ron stood up immediately and shouted, "What the bloody hell is wrong with you, you greasy git?" Yeah, Harry stood up too. That probably would have done it, but they had to be sure that Snape would be furious enough to want them expelled and have enough ammunition to actually make a case of it. Slime ball. That's why they each reached into the pockets of their robes, pulled out a handful of dung bombs, and threw them on the floor at Snape's feet. The reaction was immediate. The other students lurched to their feet, covering their mouths and noses, and ran for the door. Hermione, retching and glaring at them, followed suit. Snape did not move. He stood in front of them, staring at them, and his face grew angrier and angrier by the second. The room seemed to grow colder. "I would take point from Gryffindor," he spoke without moving his lips, "but you'll be expelled for this. Come with me. The headmaster has that happy authority." Harry and Ron marched in front of him, and glad of it because neither one could help smirking. Snape had fallen right into their hands. No matter how brave he was, and how much Harry had regretted not trusting him, it still felt pretty good. Ugh, what's that smell? The students rushed to get out of the way and stared after them. Harry could hear Snape growling threats under his breath. It seemed to take no time at all to get to the familiar gargoyle. "Lemon drops," Snape hissed. It jumped aside. "Up. Now." Snape pushed them roughly out of the way and pounded on the heavy door. "Dumbledore." "Enter." Dumbledore's voice. "What is it, Severus?" "Is it co-op?" Harry stared at the floor, marshaling his thoughts and fighting back tears. He hadn't seen Dumbledore alive for an entire decade, and he was their absolute best chance. He, Ron, and Ginny had become pretty powerful, but Dumbledore was formidable, both with his wand and with his mind. He could tell them where the holes in their plans were. He could make it airtight. Harry hadn't known how much of a relief it would be. He peeked and saw Dumbledore's face as he heard a slightly exaggerated, although it wasn't really necessary, what he and Ron had done was damning enough, version of events from Snape. He did not look angry, but he did have a look on his face that Harry couldn't read. "The Weasley boy called me a greasy git, and Potter called me a slime ball, right before they threw the dung bombs," Snape said with relish. After a long, long moment, Dumbledore said very quietly, "Look at me." Ron, who'd been shaking with silent laughter for the last several minutes, stopped and looked up. Despite the fact that they pretty much knew that they weren't going to be in serious trouble, well, they knew that they wouldn't be expelled. Harry could see apprehension on his friend's face. "You've done serious damage today," Dumbledore said to the both of them. Several portraits on the walls agreed. "Bring back corporal punishment and send them back home with bloody backs," Phineas Nigellus suggested laconically. Snape appeared to agree wholeheartedly. "Enough, Phineas." Dumbledore held up a hand to silence the portrait of Sirius Ancestor and Hogwarts' least popular headmaster. The two of you have shown blatant disregard for authority, caused the potions classroom to be evacuated, disrupted class, and did it with dung bombs, a substance ban at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please explain to me why you did this. You're letting them explain? Snape asked, horrified. Just expel them and be done with it. Severus. I see no possible explanation that would save them from being expelled. Dumbledore seemed a little sad as he peered at Harry. I do, Ron said loudly. Snape looked ready to murder him, but then he pinned a glare on Harry so malevolent that Harry actually took a step backward. You knew it could go both ways, Dumbledore, Snape sneered. This only proves it. We've got another Dark Lord, not a bloody savior. Harry and Ron exchanged uncertain glances, and Harry had a sneaking suspicion that the prophecy was very, very different here. After that moment of confusion, Ron laughed out loud. And not to forget the loyal follower, Snape said. Dumbledore said nothing, but appeared to be deep in thought. It explains much. The reason why he's marked as an equal. This time, Harry laughed. It burst out of him. He couldn't stop it. He felt bitterness and incredulity, and that's where part of the laughter came from, the part that also wanted to cry. The majority of it, however, was simply because it was funny. Ron laughed with him, and Harry feared that they both sounded quite mad. He couldn't wait to hear Ginny's reaction. With an effort, Harry stopped. He wiped his eyes, adjusted his robes, and, feeling more confident, met Dumbledore's eyes. The brilliant blue eyes did not have even a trace of the familiar twinkle. In fact, Dumbledore looked concerned, perplexed, and quite angry. But Harry felt comforted nonetheless. We did it so we could come up here and talk to you without suspicion, Harry said. Yeah, sorry about the things we said. And about the dung bombs, Ron chuckled. I don't really think you're a greasy git. And I don't think you're Slimeball, Harry added. They're lying. Snape shouted, outraged. Dumbledore, don't listen to them. Well, you're a bit of a greasy git. Harry heard the fondness in Ron's voice. But he didn't think the other two did because they found themselves thrown into rapidly conjured chairs and tied there with ropes made of what looked like liquid magic. Harry settled himself more comfortably. You are trying my patience, Dumbledore said coldly. Nice wand, Harry said pointedly. They're both mad, Snape said, sounding triumphant. That's what the bent line meant. Potter's unhinged, and he took Weasley with him. Hold a moment, Severus. Why on earth did you want to see me without anyone knowing? We're not mad. Professor, Harry said. He'd started to tremble a little. Yeah, but you've got to promise to listen to us, Ron added. I do not believe you gentlemen are in any position to make demands. Speak quickly. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Ron asked Harry. Yes, Harry said. They both turned to stare at the wand Dumbledore held. He was not pointing it at them, but they both knew that Dumbledore was very, very fast. He just might use the Elder Wand on us, Ron said. Oh, honestly, Snape said scathingly. He turned to Dumbledore. Harry had to admire the shuttered expression on the older man's face that masked the surprise he must be feeling. Absurd pride bubbled up inside him. Explain, he said again, but in a different tone. It was a mixture of danger and confusion. We're from the future, Ron said cheerfully. Snape pulled out his wand, rushed over to stand in front of Ron, and pointed it straight at his head. Stand down, Severus, Dumbledore said. He had risen from his chair. I'm almost certain the boys are mad, but they knew that I have the Elder Wand, and I will know why. Snape's wand clattered to the floor. You have the Elder Wand? Isn't that a fairy tale? No, Dumbledore said. The Deathly Hallows are very real. Yeah, and you have another one, don't you? Ron smirked. Where's Harry's cloak? Dumbledore sat down heavily. Why? You're still asking for explanations when these two should have been expelled 10 minutes ago and sent on their merry way, Snape said, but he still looked unsettled. I think if he asked how he'd get a truthful answer and a reason for the bent line as well, Harry said quietly. They'd had their fun, and now it was time for the truth. Dumbledore's brow furrowed. We used the tears of Merlin, Harry continued. The wizard lifted his head up sharply. Impossible. The Tears of Merlin is just a fairy tale, Snape said. Yeah, just like the Deathly Hallows, Ron told him. It is possible, Severus, Dumbledore's expression was absolutely unreadable. But I'm not yet sure if I believe them. Prove it. Harry closed his eyes, wishing that he did not have to do this. But the portrait of the man sitting in front of him had told him that this was what he must do if Dumbledore required incontrovertible proof. And with all the gentleness he was capable of, he said, "You see Ariana in the mirror of Erist, and the family you lost. Your father, dead in Azkaban, because he avenged what the 3 Muggle boys did to your sister. Your mother who died accidentally because of your sister. Your sister dead because she got in the middle of a duel between 3 boys. Your brother, who has never, ever trusted you since then. They all stand there before you, smiling, and you know that they've forgiven you for your mistakes. And there's someone else there. You also see," he licked his lips, "you also see a man who never existed. A kind Gellert Grindelwald." "Enough!" Snape shouted. "What is this vile madness you're sprouting, Potter?" Harry could not bear to see the pain on Dumbledore's face. He looked away. Why? It had worked, Harry thought. Or Dumbledore thought he meant to torment him, and was asking why he would do such a thing. But Harry placed his bet on the latter, and so gave the same answer he had given the portrait 4 years ago. The price was too high, Harry told him. "You won." Dumbledore asked sharply. "No," Ron said firmly. "Harry defeated Voldemort, but we lost everyone else except for my sister. She's here too." "Well, not here. I expect she's at the Burrow." "Dumbledore?" Snape asked. "Severus, what Harry said could only have come from my own mouth. I have to believe him." "I'm sorry," Harry said. "Your portrait." "My portrait?" Dumbledore interrupted. "I did not survive." "No, Snape killed you," Ron said bluntly. "I would never." "You would if you knew that Dumbledore was dying, surrounded by Death Eaters, and by his own command." "Fenrir Greyback was there, as well as Bellatrix Lestrange," Harry replied. He looked away, remembering that death, and how it had shaped the years of the Horcrux hunt, and how things might have been different if he had only known. This time it would be different. He turned back to Dumbledore, who suddenly looked very, very old. "Please tell me the prophecy. I already know there are differences." "What was your prophecy?" Dumbledore asked. Harry told him, and his voice only shook a little when he stated the part that meant he was a Horcrux. He knew this time, though, it wouldn't be too late. "It is very similar," Dumbledore said. "The one in the here and now is this. The chosen one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him. Born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have terrible power the Dark Lord knows not. He has been bent for always and always, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives." Harry started to cry. Not sobs, not like the kind he'd experienced in the months after the final battle, not great gasping things that shook his entire body and made him feel worse. But tears slid down his face rapidly, and he knew without having to look that Ron did the same thing. For always and always. Snape was surprisingly tactful, although Harry thought he might be too stunned to speak. He and Dumbledore said nothing until the 2 men who had been bent for always and always had composed themselves. "Sorry," Harry said shakily. "That was unexpected. Very unexpected." "Which part?" Dumbledore inquired. "His prophecy sounds an awful lot like ours, but with the bits about his questionable loyalties taken out," Snape said, "but it didn't sound like he really meant it." "Bent doesn't mean mad," Ron said. "That's the name of the spell that went with the potion. The Bent reality spell, although I suppose it's more of a charm." "What does it mean?" Dumbledore asked. "Bent for always and always. Do you know?" "Yes," Harry breathed. "We were bent for always and always." It felt very personal, speaking of this. "And what, precisely, is always and always?" "It's you," Harry said simply. "And you, I suppose. And Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Bill and Fleur Weasley. Charlie Weasley. Percy Weasley. Fred and George Weasley. Hermione Granger. Neville Longbottom. Dean Thomas. Remus Lupin. Dora Lupin. Teddy Lupin. Luna Lovegood. Colin Creevey. Cho Chong. Cedric Diggory. And Victor Crumb. Angelina Johnson, my brother's fiancée. Katie Bell. Lisa Turpin. All Ravenclaw students, most Hufflepuff students, most Gryffindors. Even some Slytherins. Professor McGonagall, Professor Sprout, Professor Burbage, Professor Trelawney, and Professor Vector, Ron continued. Dobby the house elf. Firenze and Megorian, the centaurs. Rufus Scrimgeour and Cornelius Fudge. Ted and Andromeda Tonks. Each name felt like a weight on their soul, but they continued until they listed all the names they could remember. Dumbledore looked horrified, and Snape looked arrested. Emmeline Vance, Elphias Doge, and Amelia Bones, Harry paused. There are many, many more. People we never even knew who were targeted and killed. I don't even know how many countless muggles. Almost the entire generation. Professor Flitwick spoke the eulogy at the mass memorial ceremony, and he said that the entire flower of a generation had been lost. The statistics came later. Some 40% of the entire wizarding population was either killed or incapacitated, and that does not include the Muggle-born children who are not allowed to go to Hogwarts. That number is unknown, their bodies never found. All of Hogwarts was awash with blood. The price was too high. There was a very long moment of stunned silence. Snape's face was completely gray, and Dumbledore had his head in his hands. Always and always is our anthem, Ron said. It's hard to explain. It means love, and all the people we love who we will not lose again. Harry realized that he was almost shouting. The slender ropes that had bound him had fallen away, and he had risen to his feet without even knowing it. Dumbledore was at a loss for words, but his eyes shone with fierce pride and hope. Even Snape looked moved. He was gaping at Harry. Ron stood beside him, just as erect, just as proud. "Do you?" Dumbledore began. "I have my suspicions, but do you know what the rest of the prophecy means?" "Whatever you're thinking, you're probably right," Ron told him. "A bit of his soul was stuck in me. He couldn't die unless I did," Harry said. "Knowledge too late then, but not now." "Harry survived the killing curse again," Ron said proudly. "So he's definitely made a Horcrux?" Dumbledore asked. "I suspected when I saw you after he murdered your parents." "What's a Horcrux?" Snape asked, lost. Dumbledore explained quickly. "So that's what Regulus knew?" He said something very odd before he disappeared. "No," Harry said. "He did not make a Horcrux." Ron laughed bitterly. "He made 7 Horcruxes, counting Harry." "Oh, Merlin," Dumbledore breathed. Harry withdrew the tiara from the inner pocket of his robes. "We have one, and we know, roughly, where the others are. I think I might be able to apparate either of you to one of them, and the others won't be too difficult to manage." "Harry, I think I need some time," Dumbledore said quietly. "Give 1 week. Please. I need to think about all that you've told me." Harry understood. He put the tiara back in his pocket, surprised that he was allowed to do so. Dumbledore was overwhelmed, he could tell. He remembered very clearly how he'd felt when he'd learned that Voldemort had mutilated and maimed himself beyond all usual evil, and how that task had seemed so vast and impossible. "Professors, if I may add one more thing," Harry said tentatively. "There is one name that was not on that list we gave you, a name very important to me." Ron stared at Snape. "You're not going to like it." "I don't think I could possibly be more surprised than I am right now," Snape murmured. "Yeah, you can. My godfather, Sirius Black, currently imprisoned in Azkaban for crimes he did not commit," Harry said grimly. "You were right, Weasley," Snape said after a moment, his lips very thin and his eyes wide. "I wouldn't think that you, Potter, would forgive the crime of Lily and James' betrayal." "I didn't," Harry assured him. "My dad, Sirius Black, and Peter Pettigrew were all unregistered animagi. They wanted to keep Remus company when he changed. When Sirius hunted Wormtail, Pettigrew, down after he sold out my parents to Voldemort. Wormtail was the one who killed the Muggles. He transformed into a rat and escaped through the sewers. And I assure you that I did not forgive him. Harry killed him eventually," Ron said helpfully. "Harry caught Pettigrew right after the effing rat tortured Minerva McGonagall into insanity. Let's hope we can find him before he commits that crime," Dumbledore said. Ron laughed. "Oh, we know exactly where he is. He's down in my dorm room right now, probably chewing on my sheets." "I need to sit down," Snape said. Dumbledore shook his head, as though clearing cobwebs, an unguarded gesture that Harry suspected he allowed few to see. We need to think of an excuse, Severus. They were right. There will be no expulsion. But we can't allow them to get away with it. None of the teachers would believe it, and I suspect everyone in the whole school knows exactly what happened. Snape was silent for so long that Harry began to fear that he would insist on expelling them. His fears were unfounded. I suspect that students have been brewing illicit potions, he said carefully. I know of several that would inspire madness. I suggest the Confuzzle draft. They will have detention with me every Saturday for a month. And 20 points from Gryffindor. Ostensibly because they were stupid to take a potion they didn't know, but really because in a few minutes they will be greeted as heroes in the Gryffindor common room. Snape knows how to keep us humble, Ron said. Harry laughed. He always did.
Good day, Harry Potter fans. Welcome back to our channel. We are continuing on with Chapter 3 of Backward with Purpose, Part 1, Always and Always by Dead Woodpecker. So, if you haven't heard it yet, just sit back, relax, and listen in to Chapter 3, Hallows and Halloween.
Chapter 3, Hallows and Halloween. Chapter text. It was with mild trepidation that Harry and Ron entered the dungeons the following Saturday to serve their first attention with Professor Snape. Snape's words had come to pass. Harry and Ron had gone back to the common room to find a hero's welcome. They'd been pulled in by the twins who had showered Ron with praise for being a true younger brother to them. The older students had been stunned and impressed, and Harry had felt a little fissure of warmth that even his fellow first years, excepting Hermione, had forgiven them for what Seamus called mass projectile vomiting. A burly fifth year had even congratulated them for what he said was a prank for the ages. Over the past days, even when it came out that they had run afoul of an illegal potion called the Confuzzle Draft, their fellow Gryffindors had followed them around in crowds. This grated at Snape's temper, and he had said some very vicious things to the two of them that they hoped were only for the sake of appearances. Unfortunately, they couldn't be sure. "Are you sure he's not going to make us disembowel frogs again?" Ron asked anxiously for the 17th time. "No," Harry replied, just as anxious. Just yesterday, Snape had called him a four-eyed madman who ought to be put out of his misery. They found Snape standing before his desk. On it was a thick cauldron full of what looked like polyjuice potion. Did Snape have some sort of humiliating task involving transforming into someone horrible planned? "No need to give me that look, Potter," Snape snapped. "I'll explain when our guest arrives." "I'm here, Severus," said Dumbledore, whipping off an invisibility cloak that looked very familiar. "I arrived just before they did. Allow me to secure the room." He then performed some rather complicated spells. Harry recognized most of them. He'd spent enough time in hiding that he was very familiar with spells of protection. But some he didn't. "I should not have let you leave when I did on Monday," Dumbledore said quietly. "I was quite overwhelmed, to be honest. Do you still have a Horcrux?" "Yeah." Harry brought it out and looked at it with distaste. "I had it in my trunk." "Was that wise?" "Wiser than keeping it on your person," Ron muttered darkly. He had certainly not forgotten the influence of a locket. It had led to him abandoning Harry and Hermione. "Trust me, if you spend too much time with them, they start to change you," Harry added, patting Ron on the shoulder. "I secure my trunk as best I could." Dumbledore seemed to accept this explanation and moved on. "I've been attempting to find a way to speak to you before this, but you always had your admirers with you." Snape scowled. "Were you trying to get us mad enough to do something about it in class?" Ron asked curiously. "So you could take us to Dumbledore again?" "No," Snape said shortly. "There's so much to ask," Dumbledore said ruefully. "I was obviously not thinking clearly when I told you I needed a week. I regretted that within hours. Tell me, do you know how to destroy a Horcrux?" "Of course," Harry said. "We destroyed all of them. We simply didn't have the means to do so. I thought about going to the chamber, but we couldn't seem to get away long enough. And we didn't think you'd want us to unleash fiend fire on Hogwarts grounds." "Excellent deduction, Mr. Weasley," Dumbledore nodded approvingly. "Now, what is this chamber?" "The Chamber of Secrets," Ron replied, as though it was obvious. "It's got a ruddy basilisk in it." Harry destroyed his first Horcrux with a Fong. Hermione destroyed another one years later the same way. "The Chamber of Secrets?" Snape asked faintly. "They do have a way of bringing myths and fairy tales to life, don't they?" Dumbledore asked quietly. "I think we got our task for the evening, Severus. We'll all go kill the basilisk." "Actually," Harry said, equally quiet, "we're not sure if that's wise. Certain events must happen the way they happened last time." And he told them every detail of it, with Ron's help and input. "So we think that Ginny has to do it. It has to happen the same way. We can, of course, take every precaution that no one is petrified. But the sword of Gryffindor needs to be impregnated with basilisk venom. That's the only safe way to get rid of the Horcruxes, especially if we're unable to get to the fangs." "That's very wise," Dumbledore said thoughtfully. "Your portrait helped us," Ron told him. "Ginny will have a coin or something that she'll charm," so that the coins Harry and I will carry will send us a message when she starts writing in the diary. Every time. You don't like this idea, Snape said suddenly, staring at Harry. No, I hate it, Harry replied. There's a risk, even with every precaution. If I lost Ginny. They're married, Ron said in a stage whisper. What's the polyjuice potion for? Harry asked curiously. It was too weird to talk about his 10-year-old wife with Dumbledore and Snape listening in. It's for when we apparate to the cave you mentioned, Snape said. He looked equally grateful for the diversion of topic. I think we all agree that this must be done in the utmost of secrecy. I can't be seen anywhere near it. And neither can you, he paused. Do I want to know how you knew what it was? We snuck into your personal storeroom last time, nicked the more sensitive ingredients, and used it to infiltrate the Slytherin common room to find out if Draco Malfoy was the heir of Slytherin, Ron grinned. He appeared to be enjoying himself a great deal. Harry couldn't blame him. He was too. Then we used it when we broke into both the Ministry of Magic and Gringotts, Harry informed them, grinning. We've used it loads of times. I think I'll give you another detention just for that, Snape said, aggravated. I think, Dumbledore said suddenly, that we should spend this detention merely talking. There's so much that we didn't cover. Harry and Ron looked at each other, relieved, and began to speak. They told them as much as they could, up until their third year, with the promise of continuing on the following Saturday. But it was growing late, and not even Snape would keep them much longer without a rousing protest from the other professors. I trust you can find a suitable punishment for yourselves? Snape raised one eyebrow. Yeah, I think we just spent the last few hours disemboweling frogs without gloves, Ron said. And that wouldn't even be a lie. You made us do that once. In the interest of having a free Saturday sometime before Christmas, I suggest you do not tell him what you did to earn that. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled. Harry, take this. He held out the cloak. Use it well. I will, Harry promised. I'm hungry. I'll use it to sneak into the kitchens. Dear Ron, the house is ever so much quieter without you here. I love it. I'm glad to hear that you sorted into Gryffindor. I'm sure the hat was debating whether or not to put you in Hufflepuff, and that's why it took so long. Weasleys belong in Gryffindor. I hope I make it too. Thanks for the advice about Annie Muriel, but I like my life. If I stole the tiara, it'd be a toss-up between who would kill me, Mom or Annie Muriel. Dad's doing well. Don't tell Mom. But he finished his project in the shed, and he let me take a ride. It was a bit scary being up that high. Thanks to my kind brothers, I've never spent a lot of time on a broom, and I was glad that there weren't any Whomping Willows again. Ron, I hope your wash went all right. We mustn't have you smelling like Fred and George. And good for you making friends with Harry Potter, although if you tell him about my crush, I'll hex you. Mom just read this over my shoulder and is making me change it. Maybe I won't hex you, but I will be angry at you for always and always if you let him read this letter. Don't even let him touch it. Love, Ginny. Ginny was a lot subtler than either Harry or Ron, but it did not take long for Harry gripped the parchment in his hands, set his wand against it, and muttered their favorite words. Always and always. My Harry, we've been back for nearly a week, and I still can't believe this miracle. Mom and Dad are wonderful, just like we remembered. Bill stopped by for breakfast last Wednesday. Apparently he was in the country for some sort of Gringotts business, and I fell off my chair. I've been on the verge of tears for almost every minute of every day. And I'm not even at Hogwarts where I can see more people besides Mom, Dad, and a brother or two. Tell me all about your talk with Dumbledore and Professor Snape. What is this prophecy, and why does everyone know it? You don't think it's anything to really worry about, do you? And if so, what are we going to do about it? I wanted to ask Mom about it. But what if it's suspicious? Also, she's very, very angry with Ron for the prank the two of you pulled. I'd pay loads of galleons to have been able to watch. If the letter from Dumbledore hadn't arrived soon after Percy's, Ron would have gotten a howler. Tell Ron to stop reading this now. Harry, I miss you. You did very well at the train station, but that moment you looked at me from the compartment, I just wanted to run to you and hold you. Can you imagine Mom's reaction? These past few days at the Burrow have been happier than I could have guessed. The only thing missing is you. 4 years is a long time to wait. I charmed this parchment, obviously, and I'm writing this in the dead of night. Mom isn't suspicious at all, but she would be if I was to strike up a secret correspondence. For now, I think it best if you keep writing the way you two did with the first letter, and good job, boys, with the subtlety. I love you both, always and always. Ginny. Harry smiled, even though he ached to see her. He wished he could take his quill and write her the sort of love letter that he wanted and send Hedwig back to the burrow, but she was right. Still, he carefully folded the parchment and stuck it in his trunk. He cast a spell to make it look blank, to protect it and keep it safe. The Saturday detentions went well, although they talked rather than did anything with the Horcruxes. Professor Dumbledore had brought down his pensieve, which made the telling much faster and easier. Not to mention that there might have been miscommunication or misunderstandings. The pensieve allowed the two older men to view the memories objectively. Snape emerged, ashen, one night. You could have warned me, Potter. Do you have any idea how bizarre it felt to be flying through the air with no means of support while you two and that Granger girl flew on the back of a dragon? It felt pretty bizarre to fly on the dragon, actually, Harry told him. Now how do you two suppose we get the cup from Gringotts? They continued in that manner to hone the plan, fine-tune it, and make sure that they left themselves enough leeway to change it if they must. Dumbledore's portrait had been right to insist that they tell his living counterpart. Harry could not imagine doing it any other way. Still, this time around it was different, and Harry was grateful. Dumbledore had been mindful of his childhood, and had sought to protect him, even if Harry had cause to resent it. This Dumbledore treated Harry as an equal, and Ron too. It was very refreshing. The only blight on the days leading up to Halloween came from a source that Harry ought to have expected. Hermione. It bothered Ron quite a lot. He did not like deceiving her, for that matter, neither did Harry. But they couldn't possibly tell her the secret. Not yet, and not for a long time. But whatever misgivings he had about it, Ron's were even worse. He didn't speak of it much, but the look on his face when he stole glances at Hermione was that of wistful longing. Harry actually looked forward to the troll, the instance that would bind them in friendship. He tried very hard not to think about Hermione aflame. But Ron's thoughts were not the only problem. This Hermione still had a keen and penetrating mind, and she was suspicious. She'd grilled them one night for 15 very uncomfortable minutes outside the library. She asked them to describe the effects of the confuzzle draft, to describe exactly where and when they ran into it, and all sorts of leading questions that made Ron break out into a cold sweat. "I don't believe you," Hermione said after Harry had stammered out an answer. "Dumbledore believes us." "Yes," Hermione said slowly, "but that doesn't change the facts. I was with you for pretty much the entire day. I didn't see anyone give you a suspicious potion. Besides, the confuzzle draft doesn't work for more than 30 minutes. I was walking behind you, and until you stood up and threw dung bombs, you didn't act at all odd. Even confuzzled, Snape was a bit frightening, I reckon," Harry explained again. "You can't control the confuzzling effects," Hermione told him sternly. "Listen," Harry said. "Snape just said it was the most likely possibility. Maybe it was some other potion." Hermione's mouth twisted with suspicion. "I don't believe either of you, and I can't imagine why Dumbledore would go along with this." "Snape hates us," Ron said flatly. "He wouldn't try to get us out of trouble by lying. He'd get us into trouble by lying." "No," Hermione shook her head. "You need to be honest. And Ron, don't come to me for help with Transfiguration again." She swept away, clutching her books, and looking very formidable for one so young. Harry and Ron watched her go. "I hate this." Ron kicked the wall. One of the portraits looked at him reprovingly. He made a face at it. "I didn't really mean that," he said quietly as they walked down the empty hall. I'm looking forward to Halloween." "Me too," Harry agreed. Harry looked wistfully out the window toward the Quidditch pitch and wished, for the 100th time, that he could have justified playing again all through his years at Hogwarts. But he couldn't. He supposed he might have this year. Ensuring that Quirrell did not retrieve the Philosopher's Stone did not really interfere with Quidditch, except in that last match, but he would not put Ginny in any more danger than he had to, and Quidditch was a distraction he could not afford. He smiled fondly, remembering the blazing argument. "What do you mean you aren't going to play Quidditch? Because you'd be too worried?" Ginny asked angrily, tossing her long red hair over her shoulder. "Ron can be there when you aren't. I don't need to be taken care of. Potter." "Yes, you do," thought Harry, but he knew enough not to make his wife even angrier. Quidditch will take up too much time. I think it would be dangerous to play, especially during second year. Dangerous for me, you mean? Ginny's eyes narrowed. I'm a fairly talented witch, Harry. Talent has nothing to do with it. He shouted suddenly, and her eyes widened. Voldemort will be enough of a danger, without his pet. The basilisk can kill anyone and anything with just a look. And if you think that I'm going to endanger you, and anyone else, but most especially you, by flying in the air on a broom while the basilisk is still alive, you're dead wrong. Ginny looked annoyed. You just ruined my anger for me. Good, he grinned. You know I'm right. You're a very talented witch, love, but you can't speak Parseltongue. She hugged him. Promise me you won't lock me away to protect me. Never, he said. We're in this together. I need you. But that was almost 4 years ago, and Harry hadn't known how much of a disappointment it would be for him to be on the ground while his old team, plus a small seventh year who played Seeker, flew high in the sky. Today was Halloween, though, and he couldn't afford to let himself be distracted. Breakfast was normal. Even though Ron fidgeted with nerves and agitation, he still managed to eat enough food that Hermione watched him from a few seats away with a look of disgust on her face. Here was the problem. Ron absolutely refused to say anything to make her cry enough to go hide in the girls' loo. Harry couldn't blame him, but he wished that Ron was a little more pragmatic and a little less chivalrous. Harry would have to do it himself. In the end, he didn't have to. Ron betrayed his nerves by sending his feather zooming into the air on his first try with a perfectly executed Wingardium Leviosa. Flitwick clapped his hands, delighted, and gave Gryffindor 10 points. Hermione looked angry, but chose not to mention anything until they exited the classroom. Good job on the charm, Ron, she said viciously. Think you can do it again to earn enough points for you and Harry to make up for what you did you were confuzzled? It was the first time she'd spoken to either of them since the day outside the library. Ron opened his mouth at a loss for words. Harry was about to say something mean, his insides twisting. Shut up, know-it-all, Lavender Brown said haughtily. It wasn't their fault. No wonder you haven't got any friends. Several things happened at once. Hermione's face scrunched up and she fled. Harry prayed that she'd find her way to the same loo, and Ron rounded on Lavender with such a look of murderous rage that she stepped back. Harry, hoping to avoid Ron killing Lavender, pulled him away. Remember control, Harry whispered very, very quietly to Ron. He appeared to be on the verge of jumping from his seat at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall and running to the girls' loo. What do you know of it? Ron snarled. Harry remained unperturbed, and Ron's face fell. I'm sorry, mate. That was stupid. I'm just worried is all. What if we're too late? What if the troll gets her, or another teacher? And what if she still doesn't like us? Harry slowly sipped his water. Not because he didn't want to answer Ron, but because Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan were sitting right across from them. They were laughing and generally carrying on and not one bit suspicious, but Harry was afraid. It'll be okay, Ron, he murmured finally. Hermione won't get hurt. She won't. And if she doesn't start to like us, we'll wear her down eventually. 10 minutes later, Professor Quirrell made his big entrance, shouted about the troll, and fainted. Harry and Ron were the first on their feet, and heading toward the door by the time Dumbledore told everyone to follow the prefects back to their common rooms. They didn't quite make it to the door fast enough, and soon found themselves jostling for position amongst a sea of children. Harry plowed through, Ron at his side. They didn't have much time to spare. By their reckoning, they just barely made it the last time. Adrenaline pumped through Harry. He only had one thought as he pushed through the crowd. Get to Hermione. Ron, a grim look of determination etched upon his face, was even more single-minded. They detached themselves as quickly and quietly as they could and immediately sprinted to Hermione and the troll. They smelled it long before they saw it. They both paused. Always and always, Harry said. Always and always, Ron agreed. Together, they moved forward. Both were capable of taking down a troll. A few bludgeoning hexes would do it. Sectum Sempra certainly would, and there was no doubt that Avada Kedavra could do it as well. The only problem, as they saw it, was that they could not use any of the spells that would effectively stop the troll in its tracks. Hermione would never, ever believe that first years could do it. So they had to get by on dodging, jumping, and a few spells in the first-year arsenal. Approximately 7 minutes and one stunned troll later, Harry and Ron stood triumphant next to the great, snoring, smelly head while Hermione trembled from underneath a partially demolished sink. Harry was actually surprised by this. They'd had to improvise quite a bit, and the bathroom was in greater disarray than it had been last time. He was relatively unhurt, although one of his fingers stung a bit. Ron was trying not to smirk at his own perfectly executed Wingardium Leviosa. "Are you all right?" Ron asked Hermione. "Yeah," Harry said. He stepped over the troll's head and hovered a few feet away from her. "Are you?" "I think so," Hermione said shakily. "But what are you doing here?" "We came to rescue you," Harry said simply. This was a mistake, and a very stupid idea that was Potter. He whirled around and saw Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick standing in the door. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and they were white around the edges. "You could have been killed. I can't believe the two of you would be so foolish." "PP, please, Professor," Hermione was sobbing. "They rescued me." Be that as it may, Ron then did something both very brave and very foolish. He interrupted Professor McGonagall. "She could have been killed." Harry tried to mask his wince. "Professor," he said pleadingly, and then he lied. We didn't know the troll would be here. We just wanted to warn her, and then we saw the troll coming in here." Professor McGonagall softened just a tiny bit. "Be that as it may, Mr. Potter, you ought to have warned a teacher." Harry saw Ron open his mouth, but kicked him before he could say anything. He wasn't very gentle about it, either. "Professor, there just wasn't time. It was mad, and there weren't any teachers in sight." Snape appeared out of nowhere behind Professor McGonagall. He gave Harry a small nod. He made sure that Quirrell hadn't taken advantage of the distraction to attempt to get to the stone. Harry bowed his head. 5 points from Gryffindor," Professor McGonagall said tightly. "For Mr. Weasley and Mr. Potter," she sighed. "And 10 points to Gryffindor for you both. It was a very foolish thing you did, but not many first years can take on a fully grown mountain troll and win." Hermione did not say anything at all as they marched back to their common room. She was still in shock, Harry supposed. They entered, and Harry laughed at the way Ron's eyes lit up when he saw the mounds of food piled on top of the tables. "Thanks," Hermione finally said, not looking at either of them, and hurried off to get plate. Harry and Ron grinned at each other before Ron, rubbing his stomach, moved to do likewise. From that moment on, Hermione Granger was their friend again. It was good to know that facing down a mountain troll together was still something the three couldn't experience without becoming friends. Winter came early. November storms rattled the castle, and by early December, Hogwarts was covered in a thick blanket of snow that probably would not melt until spring warmed the frigid air. The Gryffindor Quidditch team, disheartened by the recent loss, continued to practice but did so with little joy. Oliver could be found most evenings sitting in front of the fire, gazing moodily. Harry could tell that he was reliving the last match. They'd been flattened by Ravenclaw, to Professor Snape's delight. He'd managed to give them several more detentions, and could not seem to stop himself from gloating during their near-weekly meetings. Harry lay in his bed one Sunday morning with his curtains drawn. Hedwig had arrived to wake Harry up with a special letter from Ginny concealed in one from Ron. This was only the third she'd been able to send, and Harry felt that Christmas had come a bit early. "Dear Ron," Ginny wrote, "there's been a change of plans. We aren't going to Romania this year. I accidentally destroyed the kitchen with magic after she finished yelling at me. Mum said that she hadn't seen any accidental magic like it since the twins cut up Percy's pants, and he set their room on fire, so we have to stay behind to repair it and set up all the household spells. Mum says that she'll be too exhausted to go, and Dad agreed. So you're coming home for Christmas after all." Mum decided that I must be lonely, so she said that she's going to have a witch my age come over a few times a week after the holidays. Her name is Luna Lovegood, and she'll be at Hogwarts next year too. I don't think I've ever heard about the Lovegoods before, but Mum says they live near us, and that I must be sensitive because this Luna girl just lost her mother. I'm happy that I'll know someone at Hogwarts besides my annoying brothers. Not much else is new. Life at the Burrow is not quite as exciting as battling a mountain troll. You should have heard Mom. I'll bet she'd give you a firm talking to once you get home. So if I were you, I wouldn't be too excited. Dad's dead proud, though. I'm glad to hear that you're making new friends. This Hermione girl sounds very nice, even if she's got bad taste in friends. See you at Christmas. Love, Ginny. Harry hurriedly read through the note, then tapped the parchment with his wand, muttering, always and always. The real letter appeared in short order. My Harry, it was very difficult to destroy the kitchen without it looking deliberate, let me tell you. And I feel horribly guilty about it, but I couldn't stand waiting all the way to summer without seeing you. It has already been too long. Did you know that this is the longest we've been parted since the burrow was destroyed? I'm sure you do, but I think about it every day. Mum will forgive me once she realizes why I did it. Although I'm vexed at her, and yet mindful that I have a mother to be vexed at again. I kept trying to ask her about Voldemort, but she keeps putting me off and telling me I'm too young. I know it's unfair of me. She couldn't possibly know that I'm really almost 30 years old, and as wonderful as it is to have my parents and my child at home again, I can't help but feel impatient to get to Hogwarts and to help you and Ron. We'll think of a way to sneak off, and you can tell me everything that Mum hasn't. Mum finally took the bait and suggested that Luna would be a good playmate over the next few months. I can't wait to see her. I'll bet she's even crazier as a child. Make sure that Ron knows to be very careful with his words around her. Remember the keen mind obscured by the battiness. I'll bet you that if any of our friends figure it out before we tell them, it'll be Luna. Hermione's brilliant, but you know she'd never suspect something so ludicrous as time travel. Speaking of Hermione, I'm so very glad that the three of you are friends once more. I knew the troll would do it, despite Ron's misgivings. Harry, I can guess what you see when you look at her, but try not to let the flames obscure the reality. She's here, she's alive, and so are we. She and Ron will get married and give us nieces and nephews to love. I love you, Harry. I'll see you in 2 weeks, and we'll discuss a compromise on the 4-year thing. Always and always, Ginny. Harry smiled and folded the letter, placing it with the others she'd managed to send. It wasn't easy for her, he knew. She couldn't have any idea when he and Ron would send letters to her, and she'd find it hard to explain why she spent so much time thinking about a simple note to her brother. It was enough that she'd managed to steal one of her parents' wands several times to charm the parchment. He ached to see her, and it was like a knot in his belly. He, Ron, and Hermione had been quite busy since Halloween and the return of their friendship. They'd spent time without her with Hagrid during the weeks that she'd ignored them. A few days after Halloween, they'd told her everything they knew about the theft at Gringotts, the 3-headed dog named Fluffy, and what they thought it was guarding. She was now in the thick of it, right along with them. But who is Nicholas Flamel? She'd asked, frustrated, yesterday morning at breakfast. I know I've heard that name before, but he isn't in any of the books I've studied in the library. Harry and Ron just shook their heads, pretending to be just as confused as she. We'll keep looking, Hermione, Ron told her. Meanwhile, we got to find out who is trying to steal it. This time around, they decided not to accuse Snape. Things were moving just as slowly with Snape and Dumbledore. The tiara had been destroyed, at least, for which Harry was very grateful. Dumbledore had taken it outside Hogwarts grounds in early December and had performed several complex experiments upon it. He'd wanted to discover another, less dangerous way of destroying it besides resorting to fiend fire, and without having to be dependent upon the sword of Gryffindor or the highly poisonous basilisk fangs. Nothing seemed to work, and finally, after telling Harry and Ron, who were serving another detention, to stand well back, had destroyed the vile object with an awe-inspiring display of dragons and chimeras made of flame. The Horcrux, now broken and free of the bit of soul Voldemort had placed in it, was placed in a shelf in Dumbledore's office. So it was with good humor that Harry made his way down to the Great Hall several days before the Christmas holidays were set to begin. Ron had written his mum directly after receiving Ginny's note, and while an answer had not come back yet, he'd used Errol instead of Hedwig. Both Harry and Ron were certain that the soft-hearted matriarch of the Weasley clan would not deny an orphan. Harry, Ron shouted. He was standing on his chair and beaming. Even Hermione, seated next to him, was smiling. You're coming home with us for Christmas.